So I would like to welcome everybody and welcome most of you. I'm very happy to say back. I recognize many of the faces here, and this is very much what we strive for in these lectures. This is the third, of course, of the Edwin O. Reischauer Memorial Lectures being given this year by Professor Benjamin Elman of Princeton University. The general title, as you see, Undoing, Redoing Modern Sino-Japanese Cultural and Intellectual History, and today's title, Medical Philology in the Second Rome. Professor Elman's discussant today will be Professor Federico Marcon of the University of Virginia, whom I'll introduce a little bit later. In today's lecture, Professor Elman will provide the third of three installments of a grand overview of the landscape of Sino-Japanese intellectual and historiographical landscape of the last 4 centuries. We had coffee a little earlier this afternoon, and I'm happy to say that we agreed tentatively on trying to find a way to publish these 3 lectures as a group in the series of lectures that very often get published out of the Reischauer lectures. In his first lecture, Professor Elman highlighted the role of discourses of rise and fall in both Japanese and Chinese history, beginning with the first Sino-Japanese War. If it was the first Sino-Japanese War, it might well have been, it was certainly at least the second, maybe the third, of 1894, 1895. And I was thinking about that, all the different names that this war has too. Of course, in Chinese it's the Jiawu Zhanzheng, but in Japanese it's the Nishin Senso. Nobody can agree on what to call any of these wars. And raising there the question of beginnings and endings and of the problem and power of narrative frameworks. The dangers inherent in these frameworks, especially when they go unexamined, was clear in the lecture, but became particularly clear then in the remarks made by Professor John Dower following that talk. Today, when I opened the paper, I was reminded of Professor Elman's remarks about optical illusions and how easy it is for us to be fooled. I'm sure some of you also saw this story about the Statue of Liberty stamp that the U.S. Post Office is introducing this month, I gather, in which the picture of the Statue of Liberty is in fact a picture of the Statue of Liberty in Las Vegas and not the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. And the comments that appear online with respect to the various ironies that we can't even get the Statue of Liberty right on one of our stamps make for pretty amusing reading. But just another caution, as if we needed one, never to believe our eyes. Yesterday's lecture on philologists as rogues concerned the recovery of the Lunyu Yishu, the Rongi Giso, a 6th century commentary by Huang Kan, covered by 2 eminent Tokugawa sinologists in the 18th century, Ogyu Sorai and his student Nemoto Sonshi. It turns out that, as Professor Elman showed us, the preface, which Qing scholars, philologically minded scholars, approved of very enthusiastically, was not probably written by Huang Kan at all, but by Nemoto himself. And here I think one of the things out of this, I was able to read the paper, I had to miss the lecture, the very intimate links between China and Japan, which arguably constituted, together with Korea and Vietnam, a single, though of course not unified, intellectual and philosophical classical tradition were highlighted here. And we were reminded that if someone seems to have known something they shouldn't have, then it's right to be suspicious and to look around very, very carefully. We also shouldn't necessarily trust our philologists. I hope Ben won't take this the wrong way. Very serious, upstanding people, though they may be learned, they are not necessarily above abusing their authority if they feel it will serve their intellectual arguments in useful ways. Today's lecture is a further exploration of some of these same themes as Elman tries to reconstruct his lost Grand Canyon. I don't see that picture up here. Maybe it will show up later. His lost Grand Canyon of texts, this time focusing on medical texts and their place in classical studies in Japan. Please welcome Benjamin Elman.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you all for coming again. The third lecture. There won't be a fourth, so I'm glad that many of you will be able to suffer through the final one here. I thank you all for the questions and comments during the reception as well. I hope to turn to some of those questions. What about the Opium War? What about the Taiping Rebellion? What about all those issues of failure in the Chinese record that are ensconced in the historical narratives? I'll try to touch on some of those as I put this story back together again and try to get to the 19th century. What I want to do today is talk about the issues of medical philology, and many of you will think this is a forbidding term, but it is a term that has been very prominent in Japanese studies of the history of Japanese medicine, Ishikoshogaku. It's a term used by Japanese scholars to talk about Japanese uses of medical texts from China, their study of them, the uses of their own manuscripts, and the use of philological techniques to put together the canon that the Chinese had begun and see how the Japanese participation in it, interpretation of it, and changes in it played out. So this Ikoshogaku is actually a Japanese term developed very prominently by Japanese scholars in the previous century and in this century, and it has been very much uninfluential in American circles. American sinology and American Japanese studies has, for the most part, ignored this very important component of Japanese scholarship in the history of medicine. And so the Ikoshogaku is not my invention. It is in many ways my coming upon their scholarship, using it and recognizing that they have made new directions that we need all to take very seriously. Most of it is still in Japanese. Some of it has appeared in Chinese, and it has not appeared very much in English or European languages. The other term I want to problematize is traditional Chinese medicine. There's no such thing. Chinese medicine, like all forms of medicine, have changed over time. The issues of what texts were important, what issues were important have changed over time, just as modern medicine in the 20th century is different from modern medicine in the 19th century, as modern medicine will be in the 21st century. So what we call traditional Chinese medicine today as a kind of holistic whole is an invention of the 20th and 21st centuries. And that Chinese medicine went through many, many changes, and today we'll look at one of those changes when the Japanese began to apply a critical methodology to Chinese medical texts and began to use their own manuscripts and materials to challenge the record of so-called traditional Chinese medicine. This in Japanese is called kanpo, or Han-based prescriptions, and in the Chinese counterpart to it, it is called gui, or ancient medicine, a return to the ancient text and a restoration of them. So philology mattered in medical materials, medical diagrams, medical arguments as well. So I'd like to turn to that particular issue and see how ancient learning in classical learning also played out in medical studies. Medical studies, after all, was part of classical learning. Now, so far, we began with a large overview of issues from the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 and looked backwards and forwards as beginnings and endings. And yesterday, I gave a micro analysis, the devil in the details kind of account of a specific debate over a specific text. And I know many of you found it very forbidding, but I wanted to prove to you that very often our analyses of big questions depend upon the details, and often the devil is in the details. And if we get those details wrong, very often the larger picture we develop will also be wrong. The recovery of the lost classic is one of the cases I use. I couldn't expect you to go through another one of those kinds of ordeals to see what another philological debate would look like, but I assure you there are many others that are involved. One of them involves medicine. And I talked a little bit about one other episode, the old text documents as a forgery case, and I talked about the issues of Otakinjo doing work on that to show that those chapters were a forgery, and Chinese who had precursed him and in many ways had priority in the debate that he later had to admit. So that's one of the important other issues. A final issue that I'm working on is the issue of Daijun and his relationship to Japanese scholarship, which may surprise many of you. But the Daijun was accused of forging materials, perhaps a rogue scholar of the 18th century, as we saw yesterday, or not. Daijun was accused in his own time by his own peers of playing around with the Shui Jingju, the classic of water, as a text that he was able to find in the Imperial Library project of the 1780s, and he manipulated it and in many ways stole Zhao Yiqing's ideas about the text. There was a huge brouhaha in the 19th century about this. In many cases, Duan Yucai and others defended Daijun against that debate, but others accused him of the forgery. And later in the 20th century, Hu Shi and later Yu Yingshi, both landsman of Daijun from Anhui, developed Chinese arguments for defending his honor in this case. And that's where it's rested for the most part. Japanese scholars have also suggested that there are very odd overlaps between Ito Jinsai's early 18th century views of ancient learning and Daijun's later 18th century items of learning. The other plausibility problem is, of course, many of the Japanese texts that made their way from Ningbo to Nagasaki, from Nagasaki to Ningbo and then to Hangzhou, were sent up to Beijing in the Sikuchuanshu collection and project, and of course Daijun was one of the major compilers. So if anybody was going to get access to the materials and know what was available from Japan, Daijun would have had access to those. And so the Shui Jingzhu is an internal problem for possible manipulation of text. It may be the case that Daijun also had access to Japanese materials. That's a suggestion at this point. I'm not arguing that that is the case, but it's certainly an interesting set of problems, and there are some interesting arguments that develop from Ito Jinsai to Daijun and Ogyo Sorai, where the argumentation is surprisingly similar. And we do know that the priority goes to Ito Jinsai if we look at the timing of the cases. Those are the general run of the issues, and I wanted to indicate that the text that I developed yesterday, the Huangkan Lunyu Yishu, was only one of the examples. There are many others that could be looked at, and I think Vipke Dineka also, in her commentary yesterday, indicated there were literary texts that also deserve scrutiny in terms of this exchange between China and Japan back and forth in cultural studies. Now, today's story in many ways will focus on information coming to Nagasaki. This is the map I showed on the first day, a map that shows a relatively isolated Japan, having been beaten and driven back in the 16th century from the Korean Peninsula, and more or less looking to itself, expanding to the north toward Hokkaido, into Sakhalin, and more and more the northern Honshu Islands that have been, Honshu areas that have been decimated by the recent earthquake and tsunami. One should also note that at the far south, there had been long-standing communities that had traded with Korea, traded with North China, but also had traded with the Yangtze Delta. We often forget how the southern islands of Japan, particularly Nagasaki and Hakata and the other ports in that area, were so close to the Yangtze Delta that trade and commerce went from the Yangtze Delta and Ningbo, Hangzhou, and what was Shanghai as a county initially, and then later as a major prefectural town. These kinds of trading networks were very, very important. And so books, materials, medicines, kelp, pharmacies, all kinds of things would go back and forth. Porcelains, pottery, all these materials would go back and forth in this particular trade. And Nagasaki will be, in many ways, the window of Japan on China as Chinese come to Nagasaki. At a recent AAS panel that Tomoko Kitagawa and Martin Koch had put together, they put together a series of Muromachi era scholars talking about the role of Hakata as the major port, the Nagasaki of the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. And it was quite interesting that they claimed, and these were Japanese scholars, that Hakata was filled with Chinese merchants. In that fact, Hakata, the town that the Mongols wished to conquer in the 1280s, was a Chinese town, with the trading communities coming from the southern Song and early Yuan dynasties from across the Yangtze Delta into Hakata. So even the predecessor of Nagasaki, Hakata, was principally a Chinese town in the 13th and 14th centuries, and we know that there were Japanese communities, so-called woko, the dwarf pirates, who landed and lived and spread their trade and commerce on the northern reach of Hangzhou Bay, not too far from Ningbo and not too far from Hangzhou as well. Now, in this context, many of you have heard of Nagasaki. Of course, one of the atomic bombs was dropped there. And you also know that it's a beautiful port, and in this port, a protected port, there were both Dutch, as I think you all know. The Dutch were ensconced there in this little part right here, and then the Chinese were in another part of Nagasaki here. We usually don't hear very much about the Chinese in the story of Nagasaki. I think all of you have heard of the Dutch port of Dejima and the fewer than 100 Dutch that made their way there and lived there almost as if they were in a cultural prison. but you very rarely hear about the Chinese community in Nagasaki that had at its height of the trading season over 10,000 Chinese from China, Ningbo, and also from the Southeast Asian ports and elsewhere as well. And if we link this back to the Muromachi trade through Hakata, this means there have been long-standing trading networks. Initially, where Zen monks, Chan monks from Japan were leading figures, and in the Tokugawa period, where classical scholars and merchants from China were the primary groups involved in that area. Here you can see a larger map of Nagasaki Harbor, and you can see the famous Dejima Island. The Chinese were in this portion up here, a little bit to the north. Now, the Tokan, or the Tojin Yashiki, as it was known, was a kind of a Chinatown. It was large, it was a large community, and it actually dwarfed the scale of Dejima, the Dutch enclave. The Dutch enclave here looks bigger than it really was, and the Chinese enclave is actually looking much smaller than it really was. But in this situation, I would suspect most of the audience here has never heard of the Chinese community at Nagasaki. Well, you all have heard of the Dutch in the port of Dejima. And rightly so, the Dutch were an important group. Remember yesterday we talked about how they had been driven out of Taiwan, but now they monopolized the trade with Japan through Nagasaki, at least with foreign ports, and also a carrying trade from Southeast Asia into that area as well. But we have forgotten, overlooked, in many ways, the importance of the Chinese coming from the Qing dynasty, the Ming dynasty initially, and then from the Qing dynasty operating within the framework of the port of Nagasaki. We have new terms of trade in this period of time. Remember, the Japanese have been thrown out of the Korean Peninsula after Hideyoshi's failures. And that in many ways, the next regime, Tokugawa, refuses to acknowledge their role as a tributary state to the Ming dynasty and then to the Qing dynasty. Unlike the Ashikaga Muromachi, the Tokugawa declare themselves free of Chinese influence in the ideological sphere. They will not deal with China as a tributary state. They will only deal with China as some sort of other. Now, this is not equal status, but it is quite clear that Japan is not tributary to China. It is also that China will not be able to turn Japan into a tributary state. We have to understand the tributary system in this period is very complicated and in many ways abnormal. Another state, Russia, will not be a tributary state along the borders of Manchuria of the Qing dynasty. It will be given special status and allowed a legation of priests and others in Beijing in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And similarly, Japan, until the 19th century declaration of equal state status vis-a-vis China, will operate in this sort of no man's land between China and Japan, where they are, for all intents and purposes, equals, even though they don't have any diplomatic relationships with each other. And we mentioned that yesterday. During the Ming dynasty, most Japanese came to Ningbo and needed a pass. The Japanese will change the terms of that so that all Chinese that come to Nagasaki need a pass. The Japanese cannot go out. It is now the Chinese that are coming to Japan, and Japan requires a pass of them. And we can see here Japan is taking some power away from the Chinese in terms of the tributary system and declaring themselves, if not on an equal footing, on an other footing from the footing of the other tributary states. And we often forget that story. When referring to China in many of these situations, we'll be dealing with a number of medical texts. China is not the supreme kingdom. China will be that other middle kingdom, will be very rarely used. It's just a kuni. It's a bang. It's the flower country. We saw that yesterday in the Rongo Giso Analects text that was being sent to China from Japan. It'll also be that Western region. Japan is the eastern region, that other Western region. They don't quite know what to call China, which is interesting. How are we going to deal with it? And one of the terms they finally settle on, it begins to be used in the early 19th century, is Zhina or Shina. Shina will be the prominent term in the modern period into the 20th century. References to China will increasingly be Zhina. And it's again one of those etymologies that comes from nowhere and is being used as an effort to put China as a distant and not make it the supreme empire to which we are beholding to, as it was in the Muromachi and earlier periods. Now, Nagasaki begins to be home to a Chinatown of major proportions. Zen monks are still coming. Chan monks are going back and forth. Merchants are coming. But increasingly, the overreaching of the examination system in China has been producing many failures who are classically literate and are going on ships from Ningbo to Nagasaki to locate trade and commerce, and meanwhile learning about books in Japan and manuscripts in Japan and trying to bring some of them back to China. And so, in fact, the Lunyu Yishu that I talked about yesterday was brought back by one of these licentiate Shengyuan scholars who couldn't get a job, even though he had passed the local exams. He couldn't pass the higher exams. He went out with the ships from Ningbo to Nagasaki, and he located the text and brought it back, gave it to the authorities, and became quite famous as a result of that one small act of perseverance. So, in other words, what we're seeing here is Chinese-Japanese relations are already very unique in the 17th century. And I won't say that they're equal status, but Japan is not subservient to China either, and China is not enforcing a subservient status on Japan. There was some fear that after the Kangxi Emperor had conquered the revolt of the three feudatories in the 1670s, that of course he would then turn, like the Mongols, to conquering Japan. And so at that point, many Japanese feared that they were next in the Manchu conquest. And remember, Hideyoshi had tried to conquer China and then India. The Manchus succeeded in doing that. And so from the Japanese point of view, the Manchus had succeeded in doing something that the Japanese at least had planned to do in the 1590s and early part. And that sort of made them recognize that China could be conquered, that it could be unleashed from outside forces and ultimately made to bow before those forces in this situation. Now, another kind of thing that kept the two countries going together was trade and commerce. And Japanese silver was flowing in large bundles, large coinages from Japan to China. This is the silver age of the late Ming, early Qing, and in this context, filling up the silver void as it begins to be diminished from the trade all across the Pacific, the New World trade, Japanese silver begins to be an important addition to the trade of other commodities and the like. And so at this period of time, we begin to see that even a Sinophile like Arai Hakuseki, whose classical Chinese Kambun is immaculate, who writes poetry for a Chinese audience, that as a major minister for the shogun at that time, he wants a control over the trade. He wants a stop of the exodus of the mineral resources, principally silver, that are being drained from Japan and going into that great hole called China. Sound like the 21st century in terms of the sucking up of resources? It's quite clear that already in the late Ming and Qing, they're sucking up resources on a regional level and also on a global level. It's no accident that a lot of the New World silver is winding up in China, particularly in the Yangtze Delta and in Beijing as well. So in this context, we see a unique relationship between China and Japan, and I want to stress that this is not the tributary system. We have another example with Russia, and those are going to be two key aspects showing the dynamics of the relationships and the fact that Manchu rulers were not necessarily entrapped by a traditionalistic perspective based on the tributary system, that they could see beyond it, outside it, and could operate with it when necessary under new practical terms. Also, what is happening in this period is a dramatic transformation of the samurai from warrior to bureaucrat. Ikegami has called this the taming of the samurai. The samurai have come back from Korea in defeat. They've been valorized. Bushido has been invented, and they have been glorified, but they are no longer of use because there are no wars. People go back and forth, trade between Osaka and Edo, move between Kyoto and Edo, and in this context, the role of the warrior, while honored in cultural rhetoric, is no longer important in practical significance. And in this situation, we begin to see the rise of new groups of merchants and commoners using the Chinese language, Kambun, in Japanese forms to begin to become teachers, become scholars, become doctors, become a whole range of new roles and places in the society that begin to replace the Zen monk as the secular agent between exchanges between China and Japan. The Muromachi period had been the height of the Zen monk as intermediary. Now, in the Tokugawa period, it is these new commoners, many of them becoming Confucians, and many samurai who have become Confucians themselves, like Ogyu Sorai, who are dominating this exchange between China and Japan. The Hayashi group, for example, becomes very famous, associated with the Confucian school and academy in Edo. We'll talk more about that. We also note that medical schools are emerging. The Taki family medical school in Edo will later become the Ikkakan, the medical academy under the Tokugawa in the Kansei reign of the late 18th century. So we have a whole range of new movements. Japan is changing dramatically. The enforced semi-isolation, the lack of roles of warriors after the warring states. Warriors have to do other things. and these new commoners have opportunities they've never had before in this aristocratic society. The rise of printing, a new reading audience, the need for Chinese becomes more and more important as a framework for people to rise in the system. Social circulation is possible. It is not Dutch that they are studying in the 17th and 18th century. It is Chinese Kambun that they are studying. And this is in many ways one of the great periods of mastery of Chinese learning that we have outside of China. A good much of Japanese sinology in the 19th and 20th century, to which we all agree is essential for our understanding of China, comes from this crescendo of studies of China, studies of Chinese language, studies of Chinese literature in the 18th century, when down to the village headman, people were learning Chinese script and forms of reading and writing, albeit in Japanese forms. So Chinese learning is remarkably important in this semi-isolated Japan of this period of time. Now, in this context, we need to sort of also think about learning in new ways. The classical language served many things. It was not simply a Confucian textual world. Confucian learning was attached to medicine, was attached to scholarly learning in mathematics, was attached to astronomy, was attached to literature, was attached to a whole range of areas that we have in many ways overlooked by focusing on Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism. If we simply focus on classical language, classical learning, this new form of literacy has empowered new generations not only in China and in Korea and in Vietnam, but we also see it increasingly in the rise of the commoners, the rehabilitation of the samurai in the 18th century as bureaucrats and scholars and writers and as doctors. The rise of the doctor, the rise of the physician is an important phenomenon in China in the Ming and Qing. It is an equally important phenomenon in the period of the Tokugawa, and we will probably find similar issues emerging in the Joseon Korean period as well, that this classical language carries over, that there are medical classics as well as the Confucian classics, and that those medical classics, the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Treatise, the Shanghan Luan, the Treatise on Cold Damage Disorders, and these others are written in classical Chinese from the ancient period, and they have to be mastered the way the 4 books are, the 5 classics are, the Analects and others. They come from those ancient materials. And so in China, if you failed an exam over and over again, as 95% of the people did, you had to do other things with your classical language, and that classical language was empowering in medicine, in education, in pedagogy, and in literature, and in writing of novels. Similarly, in Japan, even in an aristocratic society, the classical language empowered many people to become teachers, become merchants, from merchants becoming monks, from monks becoming Confucians, and from doctors becoming Confucians as well. What's interesting in the social circulation, doctors became Confucians. They were not higher status. A doctor's son hoped to become a Confucian classical scholar. That seemed to be a higher level of status within society. I'm not agreeing whether that is good or bad. I'm simply acknowledging that was the social status system of that time and place. Now, in this context, there begins to be an interesting brouhaha between the China lovers and the China haters, the Sinophiles and the Sinophobes. Japan has always had a kind of difficult relationship with China, and particularly after the wars of the 1590s and the like, the ability to deal with China both as ideal and danger, is paramount in the 18th century as well. And during the boom of the 18th century, when everybody is learning Kambun, everybody is learning the language as much as they can, some well, some not so well, people begin to emerge to attack this. Motoori Norinaga is certainly one of the most prominent in the late 18th century as a nativist, a scholar, a commoner, who begins to argue that this Chinese learning is dangerous. But what's interesting about Motoori Norinaga is that he is trained in traditional Chinese medicine, and that he makes a living in traditional Chinese kampo, and during the day makes a living by doing the kind of thing that his mother made possible for him by paying for his education in Kyoto to study with Confucian scholars whose focus was on medicine. At night, he writes tracts and delivers lectures attacking Chinese learning. But in fact, he himself is remarkably proficient in the Chinese language, remarkably proficient in the medical learning coming from China in that period of time, and he practices it in his hometown outside of the areas of Kyoto. So in this situation, we begin to have some interesting contrasts between those who think Chinese learning is going too far and those who think Chinese learning is ultimately what we need to focus on and develop and to prosper with. This will affect many of the reforms of the 18th century, from Yoshimune all the way to Matsudaira Sadanobu in the Kansei reforms, where the Kansei reforms are consciously based still on the civil examinations of China and the medical systems of China as well, as Matsudaira Sadanobu tries to put in place a framework of bureaucracy under the Tokugawa that will ultimately encompass all the domains around him. It fails over the short term, but over the long term, those state developments are leading into the Meiji policies for the creation of a unified Japanese nation. Now, this is also the peak of the period of what we call evidential studies, whether we call it Hanshue, Kangaku. The Kangakusha is a very important figure in 18th century Japan. There are huge biographical dictionaries of the great Kangakusha, the Hanshue-ja of Tokugawa Japan, and they are focusing on the classics and the new terms of understanding them, which are based on philology, the issues of we talked about yesterday, phonology, paleography, and etymology. These are part and parcel and are very important in the Japanese learning about the Chinese language and the like. We know, of course, that the Japanese read the kanbun with peculiar markings to tell them how to read them using Japanese grammar. The kundoku readings remain prominent, but nonetheless, the texts themselves remain true to a classical Chinese script written. We informs that Chinese can read without having to use the kundoku, the outside markings for these texts. We also begin to see textbooks emerging in Japan on a wide order in Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka that teach kanbun. And a scholar can make a nice living, not just by opening an academy and teaching scholars, teaching students. One can also make a nice living in the print culture of Kyoto and Edo and Osaka in the 18th century by writing primers for the classical language. And in fact, we begin to see many of the prominent writers, many of the prominent literati of Japan in this period of time, beginning to write in forms to present how do we learn classical Chinese? How are we to learn Chinese in this situation? And there's a debate about it. Should we do it the Japanese way by doing it with kundoku, with markings of Japanese grammar, or as Dazai Shundai and Ogyu Sorai argue, directly by learning Chinese? We have to learn Chinese the way the Chinese speak it and write it. We can't simply translate it through the kundoku readings into our version. Interestingly, the version of learning Chinese directly of Sorai and his followers fails, and we still to this very day have a tradition of learning kanbun that depends upon kundoku readings in Japanese style. It's a very important feature of the Japanese use of the Chinese language, and we have to acknowledge and deal with it, and we have to recognize that the kundoku readings are one of the chief means the Japanese have used to master what we have called classical Chinese. Minagawa Kien and Yamamoto Hokozan, very prominent scholars that the American literature knows nothing about. Minagawa Kien was a very prominent literatus in Kyoto who wrote widely, aristocrat himself, but master of Confucian letters. Yamamoto Hokozan, based in Edo, came from a family of doctors and rose up to become a great Confucian scholar, and all of them were involved in writing books about Chinese so-called particles, shizi, jitsuji, what we would call nouns, perhaps. Empty, kyoji, or shuzi. These were insubstantials, what we would call verbs and adjectives. They were not specific things. And then various kinds of multi-purpose terms, zatsuji, were used in this situation. So we begin to have a lexicon of learning the language, mastering the language, and those of us who have learned kanbun or mastered classical Chinese know it doesn't come with the air. It is hard work. It takes years of practice and learning, and even after years of training, it still is a language very complicated for us to master from every period of either Japanese history or Chinese history. And in this case, the Japanese are in many ways pioneering the study of Chinese, classical Chinese, as a foreign language. We will all be indebted to their efforts based on what the Japanese have achieved in understanding of China in the 19th and 20th century. Now, in this peak of the period, we begin to also see various textbooks from China having second lives. Yuan Dynasty texts introducing what we would later call connectives, the juyutsu, the helping terms, are reprinted in Japan in wide feature. Late Ming collections of grammatical texts are quickly sent from Ningbo to Nagasaki and are printed over and over again in Japan, and later are mimicked by Japanese writers and scholars as well. These are examples of some of the textbooks that are involved. how do you teach auxiliaries? And here you see, for example, E, the character at the end. This is a kind of rhetorical flourish added at the end of a sentence. And you have a long statement here about the uses of the term, how it's used at the end of the sentence. It's used for rhetorical flourishes. And this is just one of the several hundred characters as a connective that's introduced in the text in the Japanese style, word by word. Actually, we could use them for learning classical Chinese today in many ways. They're that precise and accurate. You would have to know here some katakana, in addition to the Chinese kanji that are added into this, but it could be done with relative ease. On another world, there's the effort to learn how to memorize all of the connectives. And so there's a primer in which, for the catalog, you learn to sing the various characters. And so you start with the characters that are I, ye, zai, jia, and you sing that and you memorize all the connectives that are involved. So you have a kind of a singing memory of these particular issues, a way to enhance the memory of using these terms and recognizing their order within the linguistic system. You can see this one is marked up in the upper register, indicating that it had quite a bit of use in these situations. Minagawa Kien made quite a living writing these textbooks for the Kyoto environment, and actually made quite an influence in the Edo environment as well in selling these textbooks. And this was another way for scholars and teachers to make a living within the Japanese community at that time. Here, Minagawa has turned to another subject, medicine, and he produces a primer for learning medical terms. So this is here what we would call the medical terms classified set of words for terms of medicine. So people would learn how to know at least the common parlance of terminology, and in some cases also introduce the more technical terms of what was going on here in the so-called Ian Ryugo, words classified for medical cases in the 1774 period. The table of contents of these auxiliaries and others are widely legion. I'm giving you one here I think you can see very clearly. I went to high school in the 1960s, and we used diagramming sentences as a requirement for learning Chinese English grammar. Nobody does that anymore, but I think many of us were sort of vilified by English teachers who made us learn these diagrams. Here you can see a particular diagram for the ending of a rhetorical flourish of how these characters belong to each other and how they should be diagrammed together. And the whole book goes through diagramming these phrases from classical Chinese to show you how these 2 or 3 characters belong with the other 3 characters. And you can see in the text talking about it, it says the RE is connected to the Yorei, the beginning characters, in a particular kind of way. There are thousands of these texts. They're advertised very widely in the print culture of Tokugawa, particularly in Osaka, in Edo, and in Kyoto, as well as other cities throughout South and Northern Japan. Even Ogyu Sorai, the most prominent aristocrat turned Confucian, produces a handbook for translators, because there's so much discourse about going back and forth that they want to be able to translate some of the newer terms, newer materials, even vernacular novels that are beginning to be sold in the Nagasaki market. And he begins to develop what we might call a syntax grammar of Chinese in this period of time. Many of you may recall we once believed China had no grammar. It was a primitive language with no declensions and no verb changes. Those are parts of the older narratives of failure that we certainly have left behind and can laugh about today. But here Ogyu Sorai already in 1788 is producing terms that say certain terms are like adjectives, keijoji. Some are what we might call sakuyoji, or what we might call verbs, seijiji, or particles, butsumeiji, here what we might call nouns. Certainly some of this may be influenced by Dutch learning as well. And then the Nagasaki translators, as some of you know from some of the graduate students that have written on these issues and gone on in careers elsewhere, that these vernacular texts were also prominently translated very quickly when they arrived in Nagasaki into vernacular Japanese for people to enjoy the novels of the late Ming and Qing dynasty. And this was known as Kiyo no Gaku, or the learning of Nagasaki, as a kind of a translation paradise for employing vernacular Chinese in text and materials. The old text movements were called, for example, with Sorai, Kobunjigaku, ancient terms, reviving ancient terms. And he actually coined the first term for Chinese that we have in this period of time, Kajin Genko, the Chinese language in this period of time, referring both to the vernacular and the classical Chinese as a single language. Here we have one that I don't have time to show you in great detail, where they're trying to figure out how Jushi wrote certain things about the Daxue, the great learning, and he said in the text that this is how you should write it properly. The key term is suoyi, the reason why or the way something is, and they give you 9 examples of how to write this in the wrong way. And they show in many ways how the suoyi, the reason why or the way it's supposed to be, it belongs precisely where Jushi put it because of this vernacular argument. And Yamamoto Hokozan is scoring some points by being critical of Ogyu Sorai in the public arena, saying his textbook gets this wrong, and I'm correcting that mistake here in Edo. There begins to be a bit of a rivalry between Nagasaki as a place of expertise for Chinese versus Kyoto versus Edo in this context. Minagawa Kien also goes on from this to develop some interesting suppositions about language. We saw some of this with the issues of the Rongo Giso yesterday and the issues of Huangkan talking about etymology, phonology, and paleography. Here, Minagawa Kien wants to use the I Ching, the Book of Change, to come up with a holistic view of language. He wants to explain everything, somewhat like the rectification of names, the Zhangming, the Seimei, of classical Confucian doctrine. Minagawa Kien thinks that we are now at a level where we can come up with an understanding of how the whole thing works as we move from sound to graph to meaning to recapture the ancient correspondences between words and names. He believes there's a great metaphysical system lurking in the ancient texts and materials that we can now finally reconstruct and put together in something he calls ekigaku kaibutsu. The kaiwu, of course, is to open up things for uses in practical affairs, something that we know with Tengon Kaiwu of Song Yingxing in the late Ming. Here we see kaibutsu and kaibutsu gaku becoming very prominent in the 18th century as a form of understanding reality, understanding names, understanding how the different forms of the language put together. And here it's, you might call it I Ching mysticism, but it's I Ching mysticism based on an understanding of the trigrams as origins of writing and how those trigrams through images have influenced our choice of words through sounds and through paleographies written from there. This was never published, but it is available as a manuscript in the Kyoto University Rare Books collection. And it gives you a sense of a man producing textbooks, writing fine literature, writing dictionaries, but in the back room, trying to put it all together, sort of trying to figure out how does the whole metaphysical system of language work in relationship to naming and things themselves. And this is a remarkable statement of a remarkable literatus, mimicking many of the debates we talked about yesterday. The new medical traditions of this period are partly because this is one of the avenues that commoners and merchants and others, and even samurai, can use to move and rise in the new system. And so it's a framework for upward mobility or upward circulation, and you can move from being a relatively modest and poor scholar family into a much more affluent family by studying medicine and ultimately developing into a practitioner of medicine, particularly in the major cities of Osaka, Kyoto, and Edo. We have some wonderful biographies mimicking Chinese biographies of doctors. Asada Sohaku's manuscript history of physicians in the Tokugawa era, later published in the Kyoto area, talks about the rise of the new school focusing on ancient medical remedies, the Koiho in the 18th century. And he focuses in particular in one of his biographies on Yoshimasu Todo, who we'll be talking about a little bit more. Todo is an interesting example of someone who became a leading proponent of Chinese recipes, kampo, hanfang, in this situation. And he came from a family of military officials, samurai. And they had lost their aristocratic status and became minor local physicians, a kind of the downclassing of the Warring States period, again, the rise of the lower and the lowering of the higher, the Gekkokujo kinds of changes in this period of time. And in the end, he had hoped when he came to manhood that he would restore his family to aristocratic status, namely samurai status, by taking up a military life. This would be the early part of the 18th century. But he realized the time of the warrior was over, and in many ways, we had to do something new. And you can see the Chinese, those of you who can read the Kambun or the Chinese, classical Chinese. He had realized that in a time of peace, you couldn't really rise by being a military figure. It was not its time. This is a straightforward recognition of the kind of society we have in the 18th century, where the warrior and the bushido is being honored, but they have no wars to fight and no battles to fight. And there's a changing network within this honoring of the samurai at the same time that the survival of the samurai will involve learning classical Chinese and later Dutch and other languages so that they can handle the new role in the society that has placed those duties upon them. Now, some of the figures are ambivalent about this. Ito Jinsai is a great commoner in the Kyoto area, comes from a merchant family, studied medicine under his uncle, and he in many ways is feeling imperiled by this combination of Confucianism, classical learning, and a medical tradition. And remarkably, he attacks those who try to bring medicine and Confucianism together. He thinks the poor medical doctors should stay where they are, lower class members of the society, and leave we Confucians alone. It's an indication of someone who comes from the commoner class, in many ways being unable to break away from even the aristocratic restraints that would have held him down as well in this situation. So the text here is in many ways bemoaning how doctors are successfully disguising themselves as Confucians when in fact they're nothing of the kind. That negation of that status is in many ways an indication of his own perspective as opposed to an accurate sociological perspective of events in that period of time. Now, in this period of time, we begin to see exchanges between China and Japan that are very dynamic in terms of the new medicine that is emerging. You begin to have, in the late Ming in China and in the Tokugawa period, a turn away from the classical medicine of the Song Yuan Ming period. The Neo-Confucianization of the body, the views of Li and Qi and the five phases, the bringing together of the classical text into a single vision under the Yellow Emperor's treatise, those days are now being criticized. Yin-yang explains everything, explains nothing. Wu Wei and the like, these other possibilities, Wuxing, five phases, also explain everything, but don't explain specifically how certain remedies cure certain kinds of symptoms. And so we begin to have in China, among a very prominent number of doctors, the view that the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's treatise, is really a theoretical problem, and we have to de-theorize it and restore some of its concrete textual material from the Shanghan Lun into a separate medical text that will allow us to understand ancient forms of treatments for specific sorts of symptoms, and forget about the yin-yang five phases. This is 17th and 18th century, long before the 19th and 20th century culminates that kind of argument. In other words, people are attacking what we call traditional Chinese medicine already in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, rethinking it and looking for new directions. And I think we have to take that very seriously. The Chinese learning is passed along with other learning from Ningbo to Nagasaki and emerges in Japan as what we call the Koiho, the ancient medical remedies group, and a whole group of scholars begin to emerge in Kyoto and Osaka and in Edo, practicing medicine by attacking these traditional forms of Song Yuan Ming Neo-Confucianized understandings of medicine. They have different kinds of views. Goto Konzan, for example, argues that we have to worry about the stagnation of the qi as the fundamental reason for why illness breaks out. Nagoya Gei and others in the area of Kyoto argue that we have to bring Confucian studies and medical studies together. This is a great irony because, of course, Jinsai has argued against this, and yet his student goes out and makes a name for himself by saying the Confucian and the medicine go together, and this is the key for understanding medical learning. Naito Kitetsu in the early 20th century has the strongest single diatribe against the uses of yin-yang and the five phases and the theories of the Song and Yuan period as a way to deal with medicine. It's a huge mess, and he recommends getting rid of it, and we have in the title of his work, Awakening from Delusions About Medicine in Our Traditions. And he influences Dazai Shundai and a group of others to move in a new direction where the theory gets in the way. What we need are a clear demarcation of symptoms and a clear understanding of what sorts of remedies deal with those symptoms. The diseases have to be understood on their own terms. This is a remarkable transformation. And those of you who have used the bibliography of Japanese or Chinese medicine know the Shanghan Lun, the treatise of cold damage and disorders, emerges and erupts is a textual monument in Chinese and Japanese print culture. It wipes out the most of the medical texts associated with the Huangdi Neijing and many of the others coming out of the Song Yuan transition. It's a remarkable transformation of medical thought. And in many ways, I would argue, it makes possible the Chinese turn toward Western medicine in the 19th century, and also the Japanese earlier turn toward Dutch medicine and other factors in the late 18th and 19th century. They are already curious, they are already troubled, and they already recognize that many of their own traditions are not working, and they need to move in new directions. So in this context, we have some very dynamic, cutting-edge physicians These are not all the physicians, but they are the cutting-edge group that influences a good deal of the theoretical structure and the movements in terms of the direction. More conservative groups like the Taki family, that I'll talk about a little bit later, are at best ecumenical. That the ancient learning group is useful, but we still need to rely on the Song learning of the physicians who applied Jushi's theories to understanding the body and its mechanisms of change. So the Takis are taking a middle ground, and in many ways they'll be very influential in Edo, because Edo is concerned about ideology, and it's not going to get rid of the so-called orthodoxy that it's adopting from China. It wants to have a balanced framework, and the Taki family is being chosen for the creation of the Edo Medical Academy in this period of time. I'll talk about it more in a second. Yamawaki Toyo never gets the credit, but he's one of the first to have an autopsy. He has an autopsy in the 1740s outside of Kyoto, long before Sugita Genpaku and the others do it and say eureka when they learn about the Dutch learning. Yamawaki Toyo, based on just simply being critical of traditional Chinese medicine, has already begun to argue we need to look at the body again in new ways, and we actually have to do autopsies. And we also have to cut up cadavers to figure out how the body works. And here we have some of the examples of some of his diagrams from a work about the organs, a gazetteer, drawings of the organs in this situation. And again, as Professor Kuriyama indicates, one has to learn how to see these things, and he is in many ways preceding the Dutch learning view of the body by re-seeing what the classics and medical terminologies tell us about the body. What's also interesting about this is note the text that it is written in, that the written form here is what we would call Han Dynasty clerical script. And this is purposely being transmitted in this period of time to an 18th century audience that understands returning to the past is also returning to the ancient script. And so the ancient script of clerical script is being put in place here throughout the volume to sort of indicate that our understanding, our restoration of ancient learning is tied also to a restoration of the language systems of that time as well. And so the calligraphy matters a great deal in this situation. The revival of the medicine in this context is comparable to what's happening in China, but as we saw yesterday, the Chinese and the Japanese begin to compete with each other over who's got it right and whose texts are better and who's ultimately got the record of the classical tradition better than others do. Japanese ancient medicine scholars begin to go through their archives. The Taki family buys up every manuscript they can find in all of Japan and also whatever arrives in Nagasaki from China and puts together a great collection of materials that's available in Edo. Much of this is now available through the Fujikawa Bunko collection in Kyoto University and other great collections at Keio University and other great university libraries in Japan. These materials are only beginning to be gone through carefully. It is mainly Japanese scholars who do the Koshogaku, the philological studies of medicine, that are going through these painstakingly one by one to sort of show the revolution in medicine that's occurring in the 18th and 19th century. And we have some interesting tidbits here about these kinds of situations. And here we begin to see someone like Nakagawa Kozan in the late 19th century writing books on the treatise of cold damage and coming up with the argument here that the Chinese have got it all wrong. They're using the wrong text, and that in many ways it's our guys who have revived the ancient learning of the Chinese classics, the Chinese medical classics. So we can begin to see that the Japanese are beginning to claim control over the conceptual world of traditional or classical Chinese medicine in this context. Ogyu Sorai also writes on medicine. And he goes through and talks about, and these are published quite widely, very rarely read by American scholars, and he talks about the medical texts. He argues, for example, the Huangdi Neijing is not prepared by the Yellow Emperor. It's simply a composite work from the Han Dynasty attributed to the Yellow Emperor, and that in many ways these texts have to be looked at as material artifacts of a particular time and place. They are part of Kobunji-gaku, ancient writing, and he will go through most of these as well. He even argues the Shanghanlun, the treatise of cold damage order, is incomplete in its current form because it's been melded and put into the classic of the Yellow Emperor and lost its own integrity as a separate work. And he also begins to argue that we need to be very careful about how we deal with yin and yang, that there is nothing beyond yin and yang that explains yin and yang. Yin and yang is just what it is. We don't need to explain why it works the way it is. We need to sort of describe what it does. These other issues are just pure intellectual theoretical errors. And so we have what Gilbert Ryle and others will call category mistakes in the middle of the 20th century. We begin to see this occurring among Chinese and Japanese writers of classical medicine. Sorai goes on and makes somewhat of a small living by punctuating medical texts, among other things. The punctuations by the masters allows publishers to put out works that are more reliable. So if you have a text that was punctuated by Sorai, it's going to have more credibility. Similarly with Jinsai and other figures, the punctuation will make a big difference for how these texts are being developed. I won't go into this in a great deal, but these are quotations on different kinds of substantives and insubstantials in Ito Jinsai's writing that demonstrate the fact that they had already recognized category mistakes. That you mistake something that is not real for real, you're never going to recover from that particular kind of analysis. The reification of things that are not reifiable in many ways will be a metaphysical delusion. Now we begin to get the climax of this, and where I want to sort of end some of the discussion of the medical issues is sort of to argue that the Japanese in the 18th century, in the midst of this period of lack of direct political contact, are beginning to argue through their texts, medical texts as with classical texts that we looked at yesterday, that they are the real China. They are the second Rome. China is no longer Rome in this context. Now, of course, there's going to be a third Rome in other places as well, and there could be a third China in Vietnam or Korea, depending on where you look for your sources. But as you look through these texts, you can begin to see, for example, that Nakagawa Kozan begins to have belittling references to China in his work, and Chinese and Japanese scholars begin to say that he goes too far. Well, we must take seriously the Chinese contributions. We can't simply dismiss them. And he goes on to say, well, I'm sorry, but in the end, it's our guys did it. Our guys reconstructed the classic of cold damage disorders. The Chinese didn't have the proper texts, and they didn't quite understand what was going on. Similarly, Asada Sohaku, who writes an account of Japanese medicine in this period of time, acknowledges that the return to antiquity was powered by our texts, our materials, our resources, and we have outdone China. Note here how the failure in the 1590s and the failures of the dealing with the Chinese in the 17th and 18th century are being sublimated into triumphs in cultural realms, triumphs in the realms of medicine and in classical learning, that Sorai, Jinsai can say, we do it better than the Chinese do themselves. Of course, the Qing is a preeminent empire, and they have to fear it and deal with it, but nonetheless, on many levels of classical learning, the Japanese will claim we are more Chinese than the Chinese are. Okay. Now, not everyone felt this way, and Ota Kinjo, who I cited yesterday about admitting that he no longer had priority in the debate about the old text chapters of the documents, actually concludes quite differently that in the transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty, there was a kakume, here a transformation of dynasty. Kakume, of course, Goming means revolution in our current terms, but at that time it simply meant transformation in dynasty, and he argued in many ways that the Manchus have proven themselves. They have brought order to China in the 18th century, and that in this context, we shouldn't take into account that they are barbarians, that they are actually doing even better than the Han Chinese rulers that ruled in the past, and that we have to acknowledge they're bringing together a great Qing state that has brought together a new era of learning that we will call Shingaku. So rather than simply Songxue or Sogaku, we now have a new realm called Shingaku. And Ota Kinjo and others will be pioneering scholars of Shingaku in the early 19th century. Now, the Taki family, I don't want to go on much longer, is an interesting family to trace because they claim that their family traditions go back to the Kyoto, great Tamba family in Heian, that they served the imperial court in Kyoto, and then after 18 generations or so, we find them in Edo. Quite miraculously, the genealogy doesn't prove that they actually are the Tamba family, but they claim they are. And they then make the claim that they've moved from being the physicians to the emperor in Kyoto to the shogun in Edo. And through that interesting invention of themselves, they, of course, become the creators of the medical academy that the Tokugawa will support in the Kansei reign in the late 18th century. And these members here, most of us have never heard of them. Takimoto Kata, Takimoto Nori. These are masters of Chinese learning, masters of traditional Chinese texts, and it was their medical texts that were later shipped to Shanghai in the 1930s to reproduce all of the medical texts from China that had survived in Japan. A huge compendium called the Sekigo, the collection of medical texts from China that were preserved and available in Japan over these years. This becomes a great family, and this family begins to be an example of rising from a medical profession into the highest levels of sort of semi-aristocracy within the Edo regime. They also begin examinations. We have often said that the examinations only begin in Japan in the Meiji period, that the Japanese never bothered with examinations. They never bothered with them on the scale that the Chinese did, but certainly in the Kansei period, Matsudaira Sadanobu begins examinations that focus on medical learning and also focus on classical learning. A small number of samurai and a larger number of doctors must pass these examinations to enter into the academy, the official academy of Confucian learning or the official academy of medical learning. And among the examinations is having to treat actually ill patients who have particular diseases. The candidates are brought into the room, they have to size up the situation, make their analysis, and then explain what disease and what curative forms these must take. And I think this is in many ways an interesting framework of change already in the Kansei period that lasted on a small scale into the early parts of the 20th century, in early parts of the 19th century. So in conclusion, I would argue that what we're seeing here is in this period of the 18th and early 19th century, a tremendous concern about China, both positive and negative, but that in many ways China is still the model that we must emulate in terms of state building, in terms of culture building, in terms of medical traditions, and that these issues must be understood first before we understand what the Dutch learning, the medical learning, and training of the sciences in the 19th century will do to this system and transform it. We have in many ways put that transformation a bit too early and argued that Dutch learning already in the 18th century overturned everything, when in fact it only had begun to interact with these changes that are happening in so-called ancient medicine in Japan in this period of time. When you are querying your own tradition and you question its theoretical basis, as most Japanese and Chinese doctors are doing in the 18th and 19th centuries, you see that they are open more and more to what the Dutch can cure and what kinds of diseases like cholera they're capable of dealing with that our traditions perhaps are incapable of dealing with. And so I think we must understand that the Japanese remained ambiguous about China as they do today, that they admired China in the 18th and 19th century, but that they also wished to surpass it. And that's been a long-standing story and quest, I think, in the Japanese case. Now, to put this a little bit forward, just to talk about getting back to 1894-95, the Japanese watched China very carefully in the 19th century because Japan emulated and respected and feared China so much, particularly the Manchu regime, that the Opium War occurred and they watched it very carefully, and they were worried that this was a new sign of something that would in many ways change the nature of Asia. The Taiping Rebellion in many ways enhanced that and made it seem as if there are troubles in China and we need to sort of be aware of those kinds of issues. When we get to the 1880s and 1883-84 war with France, however, we note that many Japanese accounts, as in many European accounts, argue that the Chinese have come a long way since the Opium War. They have a navy, they have steamships, they have power. We talked about the ironclad vessels, the first talk. They have all of that already. And in the war with the French, while they lost the naval battles, they won all the battles on land. And in many ways, the French in 1883-84 were unable to enforce their demands for territorial sovereignty in Vietnam with the permission of the Qing government, and they couldn't land troops in Fujian, and they couldn't land troops in Taiwan. Had they landed them, they were fearful they would be annihilated. So in many cases, we begin to see the 1883 period after the war, the Opium War of 1840-42, and also the Second Opium War of 1860, and the Taiping Rebellion. There is a sense within which China had made major reforms through the self-strengthening movement. The dignitaries from Japan that traveled around the world visited the Shanghai Arsenal, visited the Fujian shipyard, and remarked that China was engaged in a remarkable period of change and transformation. There were still many problems, and the demographic nightmare was not going to go away. Ironically, the Taiping Rebellion had released some of the pressure of that demographic pressure, particularly in the Yangtze Delta, where 20 to 30 million people may have perished. It opened up land and resources for a new group of farmers and people to move into in that period of time. But nonetheless, there was great promise, as Mary Wright indicated when she wrote that most important book on the Tongzhi Restoration, that there was great promise in this period of time, and the Japanese and others saw it. And it was really not until the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 when that promise for Chinese and Japanese was destroyed unilaterally. And from that point forward, we trace the failure of China from the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 back to the failure in the Sino-French War, to the Taiping Rebellion, to the Opium War, to the Manchus, to the Ming, all kinds of things we add to that particular narrative. And I would suggest to you that that's the narrative that we need to sort of put aside, to bracket, and rethink in new forms and in new ways. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. As I said on Wednesday, one of the reasons we have the Reischauer lectures in the first place is to make sure that at least once a year we take time out of our schedules, whether we're more closely affiliated with the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies or the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies or the Korea Institute for that matter. We take the time out to sit in the same lecture hall, which doesn't happen very much at this school when there are so many activities every week. Unlike other institutions where if you work on East Asia at all, you're bound to run into your colleagues in Japanese and Korean or Southeast Asian studies all the time. It doesn't happen nearly as often as it could here or should. And I think that Professor Elman's lecture today has really given us all, regardless of our disciplinary approach or our regional focus, a wonderful set of issues to think about that really matter. And coming back again at the end to these problems of teleologies that continue to haunt us and to haunt our colleagues in China, in Taiwan, in Japan, and in Korea as well. For our discussant today, we have turned, as we turned yesterday, to a younger scholar. Yesterday, Wiebke Denneke gave a wonderfully energetic critique of the lecture from Professor Elman. Today, we turn to another younger scholar, Federico Marcon of the University of Virginia. Professor Marcon did his PhD at Columbia in 2007, after having earned his master's degree there, and before that studied at Venice, one of the last great homes actually of Manchu studies as well in Europe. He has, like Wiebke, he has a Harvard connection. He was a postdoc at the Reischauer a few years back in 2007, 2008. And we have a connection that you don't know about, which is that we were both students at Tokyo Gaigodai. I was there a few years before you, in the late 80s. He is a natural choice for the position of discussant here because he works on nature and is working on a book titled The Names of Nature, Intellectual Networks and Natural History in Early Modern Japan, and has already published a number of articles on this subject. My understanding is that you will be moving soon as well to Princeton University. I would like to stress we did not know this when we invited Professor Marcon to act as discussant, and we certainly hope it will not affect the tenor of his remarks and that he will be as incisive as he would have been were he not to become Professor Elman's junior colleague in just a few short months. Please welcome Federico Marcon.
Thank you. It is, I believe, impossible to overstate the importance of Professor Elman's research on a comparative transnational history of East Asian cultural development in the early modern period, a history that breaks free from the conventional national boundaries. And I'm not saying this to pay homage to my future chair. I sincerely think Professor Elman's work on Chinese philologists in Ming and Qing China, on the system of civil examinations, and now on the history of Chinese science and in the various forms of traditional medicine has brought in the past decades a new freshness to the field of East Asian cultural history. And I confess it has been very influential to my research too, on the sociology of intellectuals, and in particular on the social history of scientific knowledge in early modern Japan. Today's talk too brilliantly engaged some fundamental issues in the cultural history of early modern East Asia that await further promising empirical and theoretical explorations. I would like briefly to highlight three of them. First, the existence of a larger cultural virtual community of scholars that shared a common philosophical language, in large part that of the Chengju commentaries and interpretation of Confucian canon. A community, a virtual community that shared a series of principles and concerns in various fields, ethics and political thought, aesthetics and philology, medicine and pharmacology, encyclopedism, and so on. Professor Elman's addressing this common virtual cultural sphere, symbolically evoked by the metaphor of the second throne, opens up, I believe, new venues to explore and reconceptualize the complexly eclectic intellectual life of Tokugawa Japan that go far beyond the traditional historiography that focused mostly on the contentious problem of a naturalization or Japanization of Neo-Confucianism, whatever the legitimacy or the meanings given to terms like naturalization, Japanization, or Neo-Confucianism, or whether Neo-Confucianism was a kind of state ideology or not in Tokugawa Japan. Instead, Professor Elman focuses his analysis on the formation of a population of scholars who in social-cultural contexts as different as Qing China, Joseon Korea, and Tokugawa Japan read the same texts, faced similar problems of interpretation, wrote commentaries utilizing the same language, the same stylistic convention, quoted the same authorities of the past, and so on. These scholars constituted a cultural basing that, although virtual, they rarely were in direct contact across the Sea of Japan or the East China Sea, was remarkably, in a sense, homogeneous. This approach is a further confirmation of the incorrectness, in my opinion, of the myth of the seclusion of Japan under the Tokugawa. Second, it was in the context of this cultural basing around a shared corpus of texts, knowledges, issues, terminologies, ideas, rhetorical conventions, intellectual expertise, etc., that a new socio-professional identity of the scholar emerged and established itself in Tokugawa Japan. A figure of a socially recognizable professional scholar is in fact a development of Tokugawa Japan. In pre-modern Japan, intellectual production was almost exclusively confined to Buddhist monks and a handful of doctors, hakase, in the imperial court. By the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, former monks and the offsprings of mid and low-ranking samurai families started accumulating intellectual expertise and started acting as public lecturers, private tutors, librarians, school teachers, skilled bureaucrats, and so on. The expansion of the rate of literacy among the Japanese population eventually created a market for cultural goods among commoners. Being a scholar, or jusha, as was the conventional term in the period, could mean different things. There were scholars retainers, for whom scholarly activity was a form of service for a domain lord. There were scholars bureaucrats employed in the increasingly complex governmental apparatus of the Bakufu. There were scholars who maintained themselves as lecturers in their own private academies, the luckiest one, Shijuku, or enjoying the patronage of samurai or wealthy commoners in various cultural circles. But contrary to pre-Tokugawa Japan, intellectual production was no longer a prerogative of certain social classes, but a profession that forms new ways of legitimation, authority, and credibility of its scholarly production, not in the membership to specific social classes, but in the knowledge of canonical texts, and the adherences to styles and rhetorical conventions and methodologies that were part of the Chinese cultural tradition. Many of these professional scholars were also practicing physicians. This leads me to mention the third point of interest of Professor Elman's work, the history of Chinese medicine and science. Since the Meiji period, the conventional explanation that Japanese historians gave to the emergence of Japanese science or proto-science in Tokugawa Japan had either overemphasized the role of Dutch studies or focused on the suspicious notion of autochthonous form of empathic epistemologies, especially in the 1930s and at the beginning of in the early 1940s. Contrary to this vision, Professor Elman's research on Chinese traditional medicine in East Asia has pointed to a predominance of Chinese studies, and so does my work on the development of nature study in Tokugawa, Japan. It was in fact on the basis of a series of Chinese texts, first of all the Benzao Gammo, that the field of Honzogaku in early modern Japan expanded from pharmacology and materia medica, a discipline ancillary to medical studies, into an incredibly diverse and eclectic field of nature studies, encompassing a vast array of intellectual and manual practices, and fulfilling as diverse an end as moral cultivation, the expansion of knowledge, investigation of things, agricultural improvement, aesthetic enjoyment, entertainment, curiosity, or pleasure, or simply the flamboyant display of economic might through collections of rare and bizarre plants and animals. It expanded into such an eclectic field through processes of adaptation and acceptation of Chinese encyclopedias that later would include also Dutch text, but continue to recognize until the end of the period the canonical authority of Chinese encyclopedia like Li Shizhen's Benzao Gammo. I would like to stop to these three main areas that the Professor Elman talked today, and emphasizing how there were so many fresh ideas to explore further. For example, while I was listening to the talk, I was thinking how, for example, the issue of appropriation and the surpassing of China also is mirrored by the work of Motore Norinaga himself. Like Ogyu Sorai and Minagawa Kien, Motore Norinaga too wrote and published books on Japanese particles, on methods to doing grammatical analysis, or manuals on writing in good conventional Japanese styles, etc., etc. At the same time that it was utilizing the same kind of empirical research on scrutiny and analysis of science, both during his activity as a pediatrician in the morning and even in the evening while analyzing the science in which the Kojiki was written. And just a final touch, it's remarkable how in Tokugawa Japan it's very difficult to separate very nicely or clearly any distinction between political events or cultural trends, etc., etc. I was thinking about the Taki development of the Gakukan and the Tokugawas recognizing the school and giving patronage as the official school of medicine in 1791. 1791 is also the year of in those years of the Kansei Igaku no Kin, the ban of heterodoxy. And it is not a coincidence, I would say, that the Taki were in those particular year emphasizing the Goseiho, the later school, and recovering what at the time was probably anachronistic already in Japan, finding the five phases, the yin yang, and basic their own semiotics on metaphysical principles like Li and Qi, precisely in the same years when the Tokugawa authorities established Jushi as the only orthodox school of thought at the time, and prohibiting then the publishing, not the circulation of manuscript form, but the publishing on any heterodox form of learning. Now I would like to open the stage to the many questions that they might have. Thank you.
Before we go to Q&A, I want to remind everybody that we do have a reception prepared. This time It is upstairs in the foyer, the lobby entrance to the Fairbank and the other Asia centers. And we will adjourn there around 6 o'clock. That gives us about 20 minutes for questions and answers, and we have people with microphones, so just raise your hands. Floor is open. Far back. Can you wait for a microphone, please? Thank you.
I don't know whether you'd have any way of knowing this, and thank you for your lecture. I really enjoyed it. Was whether the methodology of earlier Chinese learning was based more on meditation and sort of more based, like the Indian, on sort of like the yogis, kind of the spiritual insight that comes as opposed to the learning aspect. And the Japanese, in the period that you're talking about, seem to excel and want to be involved in the learning aspect, but they don't seem to be interested in learning through meditation, through their own sort of self-knowledge. And what my question is whether the early Chinese scholars, and I know you have no way of knowing, their knowledge was based more on meditation and insight.
Thank you for your question. Part of what we are talking about is in terms of Neo-Confucianism and the Song Ming dynasties had in many ways been influenced heavily by Buddhism. And meditational techniques and the issues of controlling the body through self-cultivation were very prominent in the medical texts. And so, for example, the notions of heat factor illnesses, meditation often was recommended for dealing with those kinds of issues as a form of bodily control and mind control. Also, Buddhists were very important in medicine, both in China and in Japan. We don't know as much as we should know about the role of Buddhism in medicine during the Ming and Qing periods. We sort of talk about a corrupt Buddhism that had become doctrinally very bankrupt. But in fact, I don't believe that's true, and I don't think the medical traditions of the Buddhists ended either in that period of time. In the Song, before the rise of the Confucian doctor to great prominence, the Buddhists have been leading figures in dealing with medicine. And in addition to meditative techniques, they had recommended that often people were ill because of karmic reasons, because of things that had happened in their past lives. There were metaphysical and religious reasons. You were a leper because of certain kinds of earlier statuses. So many of these things are percolating, not only in the ancient medicine, but the impact of Buddhism in the so-called Neo-Confucian schools of medicine. That was very decisive. And certainly self-cultivation was a form of meditation reflecting Buddhist impact and importance. And how important that was in the Tokugawa period and in the Ming-Qing period, I'm not a specialist. I think Federico could speak to the Tokugawa period more than I can, but you've asked a very good question, and it's just a sign of how little we know of Buddhism and medicine in the Ming and Qing period. Very few people take it seriously even.
Well, yeah, at the beginning, especially at Tokugawa period, meditative practices were pretty much widespread among even New Confucian thinkers. Especially Sato Naokata would emphasize the meditative aspects of the moral cultivation of scholars, in which the ethical principle had to be thought over through zazen, quiet meditation, for example. Later on, Ishida Baigan, for example, scholars who try to translate the new Jushi's ethics for merchants, would emphasize again the role of meditation and the emergence of the pure heart, the Xin, as he would say. So I wouldn't really stress so much a nice division between the two cultural spheres. Meditation was part of it, and also Buddhism is often forgotten in the Tokugawa period, but played a very important life, both in intellectual and everyday life of Japan. Not only Buddhist institutions were recruited by the Bakufu for administrative purposes, like for example, the registration of birth and death in every village, etc., etc. And meditative practices were pretty much widespread at the time.
Professor Kim.
So thank you very much for great lectures for last 3 days. I learned a great deal. I understand that Korea is not probably main part of your research for this particular topic or for this particular lectures, but you mentioned Korea numerous times in passing. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about Korea in the rubric of your lectures topic this week.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity. Originally, I had planned to have a section talking about the role of Korea between China and Japan, other than being the victim of the wars. Usually the wars are between China and Japan, over Korea. In the period of time when Japan and China viewed each other from afar and had no diplomatic relations, Korea was a tributary state of both. And so emissaries were being sent from the Joseon dynasty to both Beijing and also to Edo, and they would go back and forth. So the percolating of ideas, for example, many of the Koreans who went to China in the Yongjang period and in the Qianlong period brought back the newest classical trends, and many books came in from the Qing dynasty Qianlong period. And much of the royal library of the Joseon goes back to many of the Qianlong books that were brought in from that period of time. So the rise of so-called interest in Han learning, interest in etymologies and philology emerges in that period of time. In fact, there was an examination given by the royal Joseon king where the test was, tell us what you know about the Shuowen Jiezi for paleography. And the entire examination was given to a group of Yangban scholars to sort of tell what the philological issues were about and how the text deals with it. Similarly, when many of these same scholars went to Japan and served in Edo, they interacted with Japanese scholars and knew about Sorai and knew about Jinsai and saw that there were similarities between the Kogaku, the Guxue, studies in Japan as in China. So in many ways, Korea was influenced by both and was interacting with both and played an important mediating ground, as it always has. There were very prominent Korean scholars who then went on and did research of their own on many of these texts. Kim Chung-hui, for example, a very prominent figure, a friend of Ran Yuan, became very prominent in introducing Han learning. It was part of the Northern School traditions that became more and more prominent in the early 19th century. Very few Korean scholars have studied them, but they represent an important voice that cuts across the grain of the so-called Neo-Confucian canon that we think the Joseon were so prominent in. The field reminds me very much of the way Americans used to talk about China 20 or 30 years ago. There was only Neo-Confucianism. And similarly, we talked about Japan in that kind of context. And often today when we talk about Joseon, Korea, we seem to think as if there's only Neo-Confucianism, that Korea was the most orthodox of the three, in many ways maintained them. But in many ways that overlooks the people like Kim Chung-hui and the others writing in the early 19th century who had been influenced by both China and Japan. Kim had gone to Beijing, to Yanjing, and also had gone to Edo and interacted with scholars on both sides. And that group, I think, has to be studied more and more carefully. It demands a level of philological rigor. It understands not just philosophical issues of Li and Qi and Yin and Yang and the five phases and the rest of that. It demands philological rigor. It demands an understanding of what Kim Chung-hui and others were doing when they looked at the classics, looked at the different materials, and they had a thorough understanding of the Shuowen Jiezi, and they had a thorough understanding of the other philological texts. And they also had a thorough understanding of many of the mathematical texts that had survived from the Yuanming period that they later helped restore to China in this period. So they're an important conduit in this, and I apologize for not spending more time on them.
What about the discourse on the barbarian, which of course emerges as well in the Korean context, in terms of the things that you've seen, Korean scholars referring to Confucianism's or to the Ru tradition as having been lost with the advent of the Qing. Yeah. As we know, they continue to date things according to the Ming calendar for a very, very long time.
They continued to do that into the 19th century.
Right.
They used Ming Dynasty dates. What's interesting is we learn much about Qing China from the accounts established by the Korean legations. We also learn about Japan that way as well. And they visited China quite regularly in the Yongjang period and in the Qianlong period. And we have conversations, usually in a kind of a bihua form of exchange of writing, since they couldn't speak the same language, but they could read and write to each other, that very often they would ask questions that you'll never find in any texts during the Qing dynasty, during the Qianlong or Yongjang period. The Koreans would ask, why do you Chinese allow yourself to be ruled by the Manchus, for example? And why don't you protest these kinds of issues? And the Chinese quite honestly, indicate that there's not much they can do about it. The Manchu reign has been very successful. But there are those kinds of questions where the Koreans and the Han Chinese associate themselves with we Chinese and see the Manchus as those barbarians and talk about them in those terms, and the Chinese exchange those conversations with them. So they're a fascinating source. And I think that furthers our understanding of the role of the Koreans as intermediaries for telling us a great deal about China. They also tell us, for example, how tight things were in the Yongzheng period. Yongzheng was a very tight ruler and didn't allow much leeway, and most of the officials were very scared to say anything. And so when the Koreans arrived in Yanjing and were put in their compound, they were not allowed any contact with Chinese scholars. And in fact, they just cited it was like going to a prison and being let out of a prison. And they could only visit a few sites. By the Qianlong period, it had been much freer. And so by the 1780s, Korean scholars could go to the Liulichang and buy books. They could meet with scholars. They could talk about things. Does some of this remind you of the 1980s and 1990s in dealing with Chinese scholars when we first went? Very similar kinds of issues. So in that sense, they're very useful sources. And we have the huge compendia of the missions and emissaries that visited China, and we also have some accounts of their visiting Japan that give us an understanding of Chinese history and Korean history from new standpoints as well.
Mr. Liu.
Professor Elman and some scholars think that there's a East Asian culture sphere area, like Confucius area, and Japan, Korea were so influenced by Confucianism. And you used the term native learning. What's the native learning of Japan, and what's the native learning of China and Korea? And in China, I argue that Confucianism signified Marxism just as it did before it signified Christianity, 基督教. And what do you think of the? Do you think in China it will be another Confucianism-centered native learning? Thank you.
Well, I'm not a futurologist, so it's hard for me to predict. In the end, these issues are for the Chinese and Koreans and Japanese to decide themselves. By nativist learning, I mean an appeal by Motori Norinaga, who Federico has worked on previously, for saying that we Japanese have our own language. It was recorded in Chinese characters, but if we can decode those characters, we can get back to the original Japanese language by using phonological techniques that are very similar to the ones that the Chinese used as well in their own language. And so you recover the ancient Japanese language before it was written down using Chinese characters. And so that was nativism from their point of view. Similar for the Koreans, using Hangul is a kind of a nativist technique for writing. And I think nativism is a prominent feature of both countries. Korea is very ambivalent about China. And more often than the Japanese has argued it is the real China because of its scale, and that the Qing, particularly the Chinese Empire after the Qin, betrayed its Confucian ideals. The ideals of Confucius of the Warring States period was a small kingdom unified with many kinds of feudal relationships. The creation of the great empire under the Qin had betrayed the classical ideals. Korea and later Vietnam would claim they are the true size and organization for what the Zhou was really about, or what the ancient texts were about. So I think that's part of what's going on. Whether or not Confucianism will domesticate Christianity or domesticate Marxism, I leave for the future. I think that's happening in some ways with Marxism in charge, but certainly the Confucianism and the focus on harmony now rather than struggle is certainly part of this transformation, and we'll have to see how it evolves and how it develops. The educational sphere is the key sphere, and in both Taiwan and China, that's controlled by the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education, once they open the doors to Confucian learning and Confucian texts, will then be faced with similar situations that occurred in the Han Dynasty and others when legalism had to come to grips with Confucianism in that period of time. I'm not going to predict how that's going to turn out, but it certainly has gone faster than I thought it would. I mean, Confucian institutes, who would have thought the PRC would be creating Confucius institutes and passing them around to American universities?
How about a question from this side of the room? You all sitting quietly over there. Makes me suspicious and nervous. Well, then you can't say I didn't give you a chance. Other questions? Yes, please.
There's no question from Japanese, so I'll make a question as a Japanese. And my background is military. And first of all, thank you very much for last 3 lectures. I am very impressed. And one question as the Japanese ex-service member is the reason of the successful transformation from Edo to Meiji, led by young samurais. As you have mentioned, the Japanese warrior or samurai in the late 15th century, in 16th century, they fought a fierce combat in Japan. And then in Tokugawa period, they transformed themselves from the warrior to the bureaucrat. But in the beginning of the 19th century, after they started getting the information of the, for example, Opium War in China, they also transformed themselves from the civilian bureaucrats to the real warfighter again. And what was behind? Of course, one of the important elements for samurai, as being samurai, is the capability to learn Chinese language, or Kambun, and also the Chinese poems, and the deep knowledge about the Chinese history. And I think without those knowledges, probably Japanese samurai, that occupies about 7 to 8% of Japanese population, they fail to adjust themselves to the stale-fashioned, old-fashioned Tokugawa system to the modern Western system. So if you have any idea about the secret, which was behind those young Japanese warriors who led Japan from the old-fashioned, the Japanese governing system to the Western system.
Thank you for your question. I'm not the person in this room that's most qualified to answer that. There are a number of people in this room that know much more about Meiji period Japan than I do. I mean, part of the question is dealing with the transition from Tokugawa to Meiji, and there was huge debates about that. If China was failure in 1894-95, at the beginning of the Meiji, most people argued the Tokugawa had failed and presented the Tokugawa as a failure narrative that the Meiji had to overcome. So one of the interesting debates we need to sort of unresolve is at what point do Japanese scholars themselves begin to valorize the Tokugawa period and make it an important contributor to the rise of a new Japan in the period of the Meiji. That's occurring, but I bet at some point you could trace in Japanese scholarship when Japanese scholars begin to take a more positive view of the role of Tokugawa in contributing to the modern state. You're still, I think, speaking in the range of a narrative that's associated with the failure of the Tokugawa and the rise of the Meiji in a new dramatic way. I would suggest newer scholarship suggests that Tokugawa and Meiji go together much closer, and that the Tokugawa made major contributions. We are in many ways trying to do that for the Qing dynasty now, and understand that the Qing made contributions to the rise of events in the 20th century that you no longer have to blame them for. So I think part of the question is historiography. On the soldiers and the samurai, certainly samurai are important figures. They're no longer as dominant in a period of peace. But in a period of warfare, particularly the civil wars of the Meiji period, Saigo Takamori and the others become kind of old voices for the old kind of samurai. And then the end of that particular kind of samurai, the rise of conscription, for example, the rise of the foot soldiers that in many ways conquer Korea and also move into Manchuria, that's not just samurai, that's new conscripted forces that take into account peasant boys and people coming from all kinds of classes in Japan. So while the samurai warrior is a great mythological and esoteric term, it wasn't just the samurai that I think in many ways defeated the Qing forces in Korea, or later moved into Manchuria, or defeated the Russians on the battleship. There were many conscripted sailors that had been brought in by the Meiji. And the samurai certainly made claims for this, and they certainly had an important place in it, and they were in many ways leadership groups for this, but that we can't forget the role of the rest of the Japanese communities in all of this.
Yeah, if I may add, I'm not sure you will like my answer, but in the Tokugawa period, the history of the samurai is a history of huge contradictions. A contradiction to readjustment to the situation of fighting for lands, for loyalty for one lord, for having certain kind of reward, to be incertain in a legitimating machine, the one of Tokugawa in which being a samurai was a born rights, didn't fit at all to the kind of ideology that was passed through the Bukashohato and other writings, in which they would try to transform the samurai bushi into the shi of the new Confucian class order. So this is a major contradiction that erupted violently throughout Tokugawa Japan in forms of rebellions, duels, the famous events of the 47 Ronin, in which you have the rural samurai who will still believe in these martial arts by the more refined Kirakozu Negenosuke that already transformed himself into efficient, skilled bureaucrats, very smart in lobbying, creating alliances in the very complex and Byzantine, state apparatus of the Tokugawa Bakufu itself. So, in this sense, it's a very cluster of contradictions. Also, samurai will be the one who try to transform themselves into professional scholars. This has nothing to do with being a samurai, being a scholar. So, this is a transformation that had a vast range of patterns, of attempts, trials, etc., etc. Then, what the myth of the loyalties of the samurai comes out from, this is my interpretation, comes out in the Bakumatsu period out of the anti-Bakufu rebellion. I'm thinking about the tradition of Wang Yamin, especially Wang Yamin scholars of Japan, Ushio Heihachiro, etc., in which they try to translate some kind of ideals that were already, in a sense, codified by early Confucian writers like Yamaka Soko and others that try to fit a samurai into the Chinese shi, into a classless form of rebellion against the Bakufu. Ushio Hachiro was a classless rebellion, and selling his books, selling his words to buy rifles and arming the peasants and putting fire in the headquarters of the Osaka Bugyo. And he will be extremely inspirational, Heiichiro, for Yoshida Shoin and other of the shishi, the lower-ranking samurai, the activists, the assassins who killed one Westerners a month after 1860s, etc. But these were not the ones who actually won the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration was won by this high-ranking mix, a new elite that was already forming in the Tokugawa period, the one by high-ranking samurai and the wealthy merchants and peasants. They were already constructing vertical alliances. They were the ones that continued into the Meiji period. The third phase of recreation, retransformations of the ideal of the samurai came in the early 20th century with the translation of the books of the Quaker, Nito Binazo, into Japanese. He wrote Bushido, the Soul of Japan, in 1899 in California, I guess it was. And later it was translated in Japan, and the later interpretation of this text, I'm thinking about the interpretation of the 1920s and the 30s of the Sakura Kai and other of the right-wing extremists of the militaristic phase of the 1830s, will create a new version of the samurai spirits, etc., which was a modern invention that came out of Meiji and modernizing necessity, like Kokukyohei, building a wealthy state through a strong army, etc. Was actually at the beginning was based on the necessity to grow the economy of the state under the context of an equal treaty, and that was the big deal.
We've come to the end of our time, and it's my job now to say a few words of thanks and issue a final invitation. So first, thanks first of all to the staff of the Fairbank Center, again, Lydia Chun, Associate Director, Linda Clues, Mariah Tolgard, Yasha Smilak, who have worked so hard and so successfully to bring this event off. Thanks also to our students who've been helping out with the microphones. We really appreciate that.
Please, thank you.
I want to say thank you to the Reischauer Institute and the Department of the History of Science, who have assisted in hosting Professor Elman during his 3 days here in Cambridge. And thanks not least to you, our audience, for faithfully returning every afternoon. That has been really heartening and gives us a good reason to believe that the kind of community building exercise that the Reischauer lectures are supposed to be has worked. You have helped make it work this year, and we'll come back again and see you all in a year. But first, thanks, most sincere thanks to Ben Elman for a truly stimulating and provocative series of lectures that I think we will remember for a long time as forcing us to look long and hard at issues for, again, no matter what field we're in, no matter what period we work in, no matter what country we look at. It's been a terrific set of afternoons. Thanks very much, Ben.
Thank you.